Hi everyone, welcome to the first in this series of video lessons, if you like, based on the idea of looking at different materials and surfaces with oil paint. So we're going to get straight in, and we're going to start actually with looking at rocks, which are interesting because it will bring out the idea of things that are sharp and hard and things that aren't so sharp and so on. Now, the problem that a lot of people have when they paint anything is they get in their mind the name of that thing. Now, what I mean by that is if someone says, I'm going to paint a rock, we all immediately in our mind have the picture of the rocks, all the rocks we've ever seen, and what are they like and so on. And very often, even though we look at rocks, we might go out and look at them, we're not looking properly, that we look at them, but in the back of our head, we also have these imaginary rocks that we think are stereotype rocks. And that influences rather than analyzing what really is in front of us. So rather than thinking of it as a rock or a tree or anything else, what we as artists, painters have to do is look at it in terms of visual words, visual terms. In other words, we look at it from the point of view of shapes. What shapes do we see? What tones do we see? Is it dark and light? Are there lots of different tones? What are the edges like between the things? Are they soft edges and gentle? Are they hard and crisp lines? And what are there other marks? Are there textures? Are there patterns, marks on these things? So you can use these four words, if you like, and this is what I want to do, STEM, STEM, to help you remember this. But when we as painters look at things, we should be using that language and not saying, oh, it's a rock, I have to paint a rock, because we get overwhelmed with other thoughts then. So that's what I want to do here. And what I'm going to do is bring up a couple of pictures. This one first, you can see here, with fairly craggy, angular, spiky sort of rocks in the sea. And if we were beginning with the idea, and I'm just going to move a couple of things around here. If you look at the shapes, start with that S, and we were to analyze the shapes. So, let's look at, there's a dark shape in there. So I'm using a blue line just to define that. And it goes down like that and across like that, down like that. I'm following the edges of what I see there. And you can see already that's a spiky, angular sort of a thing. There's no real curves in it. Let's look at this side of that rock. You see that one there? So there's a shape right in there. Let's look at the light top of that big rock there, that big boulder. You see that? It's sort of like a diamond shape. I can't remember the proper geometric term from school, but and then likewise here, up, across, and up. Let's look at the one up at the very top, up there, a long straight line, slight curve there, down there. So you can see, look at the types of shapes that we see there. So that's the first thing we can use to find a way to paint rocks. I'm just getting rid of all those lines now. I'm going back to this. Let's look at the tones. Well, there are some very dark tones in here. Again, I'll just highlight this area here. You can see, look how dark it is in that area. Look how dark it is in here, and so on. So they're quite extreme tones here and there, which give quite a high contrast, which also makes them look spikier and harder and more angular, actually. I'll just undo that. Let's look at the E, the edges. Well, we know already really what we're going to say, because the edges are straight and they're very crisp. So the edge between this light bit up here and this dark bit there, you can see that line is very crisp. May not be absolutely crisp, but it's a fairly crisp line. It's not fuzzy. It's not a soft line. In other words, when you come to paint that, you'll not be blending those two together very much, because then that defeats the purpose of having these angular shapes we talked about. So we'll get rid of that. Let's go to the last letter at the moment, M, marks. Well, you can see there that there are lots of little marks you can see up at the top of this rock, there are lots of little pits and dots. I'm making little squiggles there just as more as a marker than anything, but you see what I mean. There's a sense of texture in parts of it. In this one, there are sort of streaky marks here you see on that light rock. So look for the types of gesture you might make with a brush. And so from those 4 words, you will get a way to literally build the rocks. And that's what we're going to do in a wee moment. You'll notice, by the way, the thing I haven't mentioned is color. I haven't mentioned color at the moment. And the color is important, obviously, because the color tells us something is green, therefore it's a tree or whatever. But at the moment, these exercises are about creating surfaces and material and, if you like, texture. So I want to hold off on getting too concerned about color at the moment. However, what I want to do again is look at quickly another picture, completely different type of rock, rounded boulders. I apologize for the words on it there. It's this little watermark because of where I downloaded it, but it shouldn't distract us too much. So if, for instance, we were to take this image and go through the words shape, okay, let's draw a light shape. You can see my white line going around that and round here and round there and so on. And we can do that all the way, but we'll not do it all the way over everything. We know that the shapes are rounded and gentle. Now that sounds very simple, but it's very important as an artist to use the language of the visual language. Okay, let's look at the tones. If you look, for instance, at this rock, I'll put it in a circle there so we know what we're looking at. This rock here, look at the division. I'm going to draw the line where the slightly darker bit is and the lighter bit, but it's not as crisp as that. The edges are very soft. I'm going to take that line out. It's a very gently blended thing, and there aren't really blacks in here. There are at the very bottom very dark tones, but not too many, not too much, unlike the previous one, so that it's not as high a contrast. And the reason it's not high contrast is because the object is smooth and the light spreads across it gently. And that takes us obviously to the edges that the E, and you can see that the edges between the tones are very soft. In other words, with a brush, we would be blending these quite gently. And again, we're going to do that. We come to M. There aren't so many marks on these, but there are in some of them. Again, we can create little textures, and there's bits of moss and things on there. So we can add some additional marks at a later stage as well. But we've now broken down those 2 images. And what I'm going to do now is try to create some rocks, not from these pictures necessarily, not by looking and copying them, but taking that information in my mind and trying to use it to construct rocks from what we've said and not from what I think and see, if that makes sense. So we'll get started with that, and hopefully you'll see this pattern emerging, okay? Okay, so having looked at some rocks and broken down the qualities of those rocks, what I'm going to do now is paint up some of my own rocks using the information that I've got from that photograph, so about the shapes and the edges and tones and so on. So what I've got here, this is just simply a piece of card, cheap white card. It's actually similar to the sort of card that you might get in a Kellogg's box or something like that. What I've done to it is I've painted over it with primer or gesso. So maybe 2 coats of that would do. I don't know if you can see. I'm going to attempt to do this now. I keep my brushes in a pot, but that's the gesso there that I've been using. However, and it's very, very good. You can get these gesso from most of the art shops and whatever. They can be reasonably expensive. So to be honest, if you go to B&Q or some of the DIY stores and simply get a decent quality water-based undercoat, which is basically white acrylic undercoat, it's very, very close to the same thing. It may not have the same bite, but it's actually perfectly, absolutely fine, certainly for these exercises. You can, as you know, you could use canvas boards and real canvases, but my advice is for exercises which you may or may not keep, either go and buy a pad of those canvas sheets, or do what I've done, which is on bits of card or whatever you can find. As long as they have been given these coats of gesso or acrylic primer, because otherwise your paint will soak in and it won't behave the way you want it to. What I've done is tape this all the way around my board with a piece of quite a broad masking tape, you can see there, all the way around, so that as it gets damp, it will tighten out again, it will flatten out for me. So on the brushes front, all I'm going to use for this exercise, you can see here, I have a little flat brush, which is, I think it's a number 8, but in saying that, you can see by my finger, it's maybe about ½ inch, maybe not even ½ inch broad. I'm using this, which is a softer nylon brush. Actually, it's a pretty cheap nylon brush, but it's quite useful for blending. And honestly, I think these work for these exercises perfectly well. I think this was from either the Range or the Works or one of those shops. Then we have a filbert brush here, which is similar in size to that little flat brush, but you can see the difference in the top is rounded top. So that will make slightly different marks. And then a little number 2 nylon pointed brush there for making little marks and squiggles and things like that. You don't need to exactly reproduce what I have been using there, but something in that range gives you a variation. I haven't, you'll notice, used a round brush. That's simply a personal choice, to be honest with you. When I come to dabbing and things, I kind of like the rounded filbert, so you can sort of go in different directions, but that's just a personal thing. If you want to use a round brush, that's okay too. Paints, obviously just oil paints. Most of you may already have oil paint, so that's okay. I would advise in terms of paint to not buy the super cheap paints from the discount shops. They will just break your heart. So invest in Winsor & Newton or maybe Dale or Roney, but honestly I think Winsor & Newton are still the best. You don't need to buy the artist quality necessarily. The Winsor & Newton's sort of standard quality is very, very good indeed. All I have here is a disposable palette, black and white. That's all I'm going to use at this moment. In this little tub, I have a little bit of liquid. And liquid, actually, if I'll just find the bottle of it just to show you, that is liquid. That's quite a big bottle, but you can obviously get smaller bottles. It is a resin-based material, and you can mix it in with turpentine and with linseed and whatever. But if you want to do something and get it to dry really very quickly, liquid will do that. So if I paint with pure liquid today, this will be dry. It may be dry by this evening. It's certainly a good chance it'll be dry by tomorrow, which is fairly fast for oil paints. So that's why I'm using it. But equally, for this exercise, just a little dribble of turpentine. Don't get into linseed at all, because linseed slows down the time it takes to dry. So if you paint something and you want to get back to work over it, and we're going to be talking about that in future lessons. So if it's linseed, you'll be sitting maybe for days waiting for it to dry. So for the exercise purposes, no linseed, okay? What I'm going to do is start by simply thinking about what we did by way of analysis of the photographs. So we had these harsh, rugged rocks. It's quite difficult for me to say, but and we start with the word S shape. And I'm going to draw these. Normally I would maybe draw them with paint, but so that you can see it a wee bit better, I'm going to draw them with a pencil. And so we're going to make some angular shapes. So what we noticed was there were shapes that were quite sharp. There's one. Then there was a shape coming down like that, hard shape there. Maybe a hard shape going up there and up to there possibly. And maybe another shape that way. And maybe that way. So you can see already what I'm trying to do. I'm inventing these shapes just for this exercise actually. So we've dealt with shape. The other thing we thought was tone. Okay, there was quite a range of tone we said. We said that there were quite strong darks and lights. So we imagined that the lights coming, say, from the top here. So what we'll do is we'll begin, and I'm mixing paints here, and I'm not actually mixing hardly any of the liquid in it, because really we don't need to put the paint on super thin or anything like that. So what I've got is a very, very light grey. And you can hear by the way I'm rubbing it that I'm not deliberately just not, there's no need to put it on in big like butter or anything like that. We're just literally colouring in the shapes. So we have this sort of thing going on. Got that. And let's say, okay, that this side. So as we come around from one side to the other, things might be getting a little bit darker. So let's start, for instance, with the really dark side, just as a matter of interest. So I'm making up a very, very dark grey here. I'm just going to reach this over. You can see here, there it is, right there. I'll put that to the side so I can work with it. Considerably darker than the top. And we'll block that in, okay, with my little flat brush. Tiny little bit of liquid there, just to make it run a wee bit more smoothly down the sides. So as I said, it's literally a colouring in exercise at this moment. And then we're going to take a shade slightly lighter, quite a bit lighter really, I suppose. We'll occupy that space, keeping to those angular shapes, okay? Keeping these sharp, which is why the little flat brush is good, it gets right up in there. Let's say we go back to a slightly deeper tone. Here, make that a little bit darker again. And we'll occupy that space with that slightly deeper tone. I'm going to leave a little sliver there. And we'll get right up in there. And it nearly goes without saying that what we start to see, you can see that light and shade suggest form. Now what I'm doing here is putting a little slash of slightly lighter tone beside the dark one I've just put in. You see that? And what that does immediately, it looks like a little corner of a room. You see that? Because light and shade, as they go back and you side by side, it will look like a block, if you know, a box or something. And then what I'm going to do is have a fairly light tone. It's not quite as light as the top of it, but it's quite light right there. So we're getting some feeling of structure. Now there's a sort of a beginning of a believable solid rock, and all we've done is follow those first two words, which were shape and tone. Now we come to the word edge we talked about, and we agreed that the edges of the rock were pretty crisp, which is why it's making that look so solid there as it sits there. So we're not necessarily needing to blend that dark into that light. However, we could, if we want, as an experiment, with my little nylon brush, this nice soft nylon brush, and I'm just putting a little lick of liquid, Now that's a phrase I didn't expect to say at all. And I'm actually just giving it a wipe. So there's a wee bit of moisture on it. It's just really to stop it from drying up. And I can, if I want, maybe, just wipe the brush, tease the edges ever so slightly along the top there, so that we're going, and you notice wiping all the time with the brush. I'm moving paint off, and then maybe this one, if I want, I can just take the very harsh edge off that. So again, very lightly, super light. I'm just barely scraping or touching the surface. But you can see that's becoming slightly blurred compared to that line. And if I take this line, again, just tap across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, wipe the brush and tap diagonally back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You see that that's becoming out of focus. So I can take the sharpness off that rock if I really wanted to. So we can change the edges, although however we did say the edges were very hard, but that's why it looks like a cliff or something like that. And what I'm going to do here is this is out of curiosity, I'm putting a little bit of light shape there. And I'll tell you why I'm doing it, because in a solid object, if you have light coming from one side, it will light the side up, of course. It will then, the light will go on, bounce off the environment behind it. It could be a wall or the land or whatever, and bounce back and hit the other side of it, but to a lesser extent than this side. And that's what's called reflected light. And when you have a little bit of reflected light, it just makes the three-dimensional illusion a wee bit more convincing. So that's why I just decided to do that a little bit there. I don't know if you can see that. Hopefully it seems more three-dimensional. We're going back to that little stubby square brush there. The reason for that is what it might be nice to do is just try to work around this now. So what I'm going to do is give it a place to be. You know, it's just sitting there in this stained sort of brown background. So what I'm going to do is imagine that was the sand or something. And I know we're using black and white here, but nevertheless, we'll just do this as a little bit of fun. Get that around there, and of course that could be going in behind and reappearing there. And let's get that right up in here. So there might be some shadows as well, actually. Well, they're bound to be if the lights. So you hear how little paint, look at how little paint there's on that. I'm rubbing that around it. So we're trying to make that look like it's sitting down in a sand or in somewhere like that. And while we're at it, we'll take a dark grey and say, okay, well, as we say, if the light's coming from there, it's bound to be stretching out. You know, it's bound to be kind of casting a little bit of shadow. So we'll kind of pretend that there's some sort of shadow underneath here, look. And that brings this down to earth, you know. It brings the illusion. It could be a bit of wet sand or something that it's sitting in, you know. And we'll scrub that away and let that shadow stretch out a wee bit there and so on. So, you know, now this solid object looks like it's plumped down into the ground, as it were. Maybe take that up a little bit there. Anyway, we've got to the edges. We talked about the edges. The last word was marks. What sort of marks were on it? And we did say there were some suggestions of rough, grainy, you know, chiseled out bits. So this is where I'm going to bring in my little fine brush here with a bit of dark grey and very, very little dark grey paint on the end of it. And while this is wet, now you can either do this when it's still wet, which is quite good, or if you want to leave it to dry, it's still possible to do this. But, you know, if I start to say, okay, I'm moving it, if you watch my hand, it's not an even dot, 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 dot. What I'm doing is I'm trying to randomly move so that no two movements are the same. So I'm kind of jiggling all around. It's a bit like the way I dance, really, you know, completely out of rhythm. So, but you see, because it's going into the damp or wettish sort of white or light, it's blending, so it's very little paint here. So I can do a few things like that, like squiggle, 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 okay. Then what I can do, if I think, okay, I want to just settle that down a little bit, take my nice soft flat brush, or maybe my filbert actually, which I haven't used yet, there it is there. And now just tap on that, and just tap that in to the rest, blend that in. You see how that's softening that a wee bit? Then I can go in with my little fine brush again, maybe a little darker this time. And, you know, remember that when you come to think about colors, this could be maybe moss or green, you know, things or whatever. But let's say the corner of that rock was got a wee bit chiseled away over the many, many years there, you know. So we'll put a few scratches in there, and maybe even up in this corner to some extent there, look. So the edges aren't neat. They're sort of... And then go back with our filbert and just touch. So we're really like a sponge melding that in there, look. And this is, we begin slowly to get a suggestion that the rock is a bit more eroded or damaged, you know. And then maybe in the shadows there might be darker bits there. And when we observe the photograph, you'll see that this is the case. And we were able to lift information from the photograph, and based on that information that we extracted, I have been able to construct a structure which is like a rock. And I'm not actually looking at the moment, I'm not looking at the photograph. I'm actually taking in my head what I remember from having analysed those other rocks to use it with mine. And we'll have a few scars and things in here. I just want to show you what happens. If I put a few marks and squiggles there, it looks really weird until I go in with another brush and just push it back. You're almost pushing it back into the background so that it doesn't jump out and it's not too obvious. And you can go back and forward like this, from fine brushes to dabbing brushes and whatever, until you create the illusion or the sense that you're happy with. So what we have, we slowly begin to get this sense of something rocky, something that maybe if we touched it, it would also feel like granite rather than feeling like a smooth bit of plastic or something like that. So here I am just putting a wee bit over there, go back in with my filbert. Give the filbert a wipe every now and again too, because obviously it's picking up paint, you know. And you could go on like this for a long time, and it's quite fun, you know. Down near the bottom there might be, you know, where it's buried down into the sand, let's say, that rock. You know, it might be all, you know, shadowy, it's tucked in there so the light's not getting in there. You see the way I'm squiggling my hand randomly, and then go in just ever so lightly, tidy that up. I'm literally just touching the surface of the paint here. I'm not pushing it or, you know, forcing it. And hopefully we begin to see some sense of the illusion beginning to happen in terms of creating a rock structure. Okay, and what I might just do before I finish this one, I might actually like to just continue the background. The reason is that obviously because of I have stained that board you saw with like a burnt sienna. It was acrylic paint actually, just thin acrylic paint on the end of a rag and rubbed in. So that I wanted to take the white off, because working on white I find very distracting. But obviously now that we're painting, if I then create a background up here a bit darker than the other one, that helps us to settle our eye there on our little kind of rock that we've painted here. So you can hear the rubbing. There it is. It's now coming forward. The light now jumps away and it looks a wee bit more solid. So what we're going to do then in a moment is have a look at something different, a different type of rock. So what I'm doing now is just developing this idea a little bit more, this idea of analysing shapes and tone and whatever. And what I'm doing is I'm just drawing out an image here, basically from a photograph, but it's a slightly different sort of a rock, and hopefully you'll see that in a minute. What you'll notice is I've decided to draw this time with a brush. I'm working on slightly bigger scale. This is a piece of card, thin card, similar to the sort of card you get on a Kellogg's packet, you know. And what I'm going to do, I've just primed that a couple of times with acrylic undercoat. Just for the exercise, I've stained it down with a wee drop of acrylic paint, basically I think it was a burnt umber, very dilute, and just on the end of a rag rubbed it all over the dry acrylic undercoat, just to kill the white and just to destroy. I don't mind actually these marks on a canvas. I like to wipe it like that because it overcomes the psychological barrier. When we have this lovely bright white perfect canvas or board, it can be a bit frightening, but if you rub it and sort of mess it up, let it dry, then you feel, well, you know what, I've started painting now, so let's go ahead, you know, and not get too anxious. So that's the reason. So I'm drawing out this interesting sort of shape, and I'll say why it's interesting in a minute, but sort of coming down almost like a mountain, and I suppose, let's be honest, the difference between a rock and a mountain is just the size. But interestingly, you'll see in the image that the shape, that S, what are the shapes I see? Well, the shapes I'm seeing here tend to be thin shapes, like slices across this thing. And so if you imagine, what I'm doing is trying to draw at least the main shapes. So I'm seeing stripes like that going all the way down. You can just about see the bottom of it, but in my case, I'm just going to let it run off the bottom. Up from here, there's a stripe. And I suppose, you know, for the exercise here, you can really just invent some of these stripes, some thin, some thick, some getting thinner, you know, some of them are running parallel, some of them maybe just, you know, getting wider as they go out and so on. And I'll not overdo it, because otherwise we want to get on with seeing how this works. So you can see there's an outline, okay, of a rock, mountain, whatever. And the first word was shape. What shapes did I see in that? I saw long, thin shapes. Pretty simple. So let's do that. The second word, remember, is tone. What about the different lightnesses and darknesses? Well, when I look at that image, I can see that some of these strips, these shapes, are really quite dark. Then it gets lighter, darker, lighter. Variations. And that's what's giving this illusion of the ruggedness, the rolling sort of in, out of the rock. So what I'm going to do, and I'm just using burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, just to neutralize it and make it darker, and white. So what I'm going to do first is put some of the darker tones in. So what I have is burnt sienna, and maybe just let you just about see that here on my palette with lots of other colors, with blue in there. You can see how dark that is when you add ultramarine to burnt sienna. And what I'm going to do is occupy some of these shapes as very dark, maybe work up. That by the way is a little flat brush, a small flat brush that I drew with. What I'm going to do is move up a scale a little bit. I'm just taking another brush here, and I'm going to work with that, which is probably at least a 1/4 inch. And again, it's flat. I like the flat because you can get these nice crisp edges in a subject like this. Anyway, I'll take my brown with the blue in it, and we'll occupy some of these shapes. So as I say, some of them are, you know, uneven, some of them are perfectly parallel, some of them are very thick. There's a thick one here going out there all the way down. Let's broaden that out. Notice I'm not putting the paint on really thick, just to allow me, if I wanted to later on, I could adjust things while it's still wet. If you lay the paint on extremely thick and oily, then obviously it takes longer to dry. When you try to put paint on top, it skids all over the place, okay? But you can see all I'm doing here is putting a series of stripes, random, you know, various thickness stripes. All at this point anyway, they're all the same tone. We'll put a little thin one in there. And then we'll take maybe and just manage to put my finger into white paint, which is one of my specialities that you may not have known, but I'm very good at getting more paint on myself than there is sometimes on the actual painting. So there we have a series of these vertical or diagonal strips. What I'm going to do now is the ones that are left in between, I'm going to break those up again like these, various thicknesses and directions, but some will be lighter, some will be darker, so there'll be a wee bit of variation. And what I'm going to do is some will have a little bit of blue, some will have not so much blue. So what I'm doing is the sienna that I'm using here is becoming, I'll just take a little bit of card that might be, it's becoming like that color, pale, quite a pale reddish color. So I'm just going to add a little bit of blue in there to grey it up a wee bit. Okay, and put some of that in parts. Okay, so what we basically are saying here, that this object is catching the light, literally catching light, so I'm turning our light away here. And so the edges will catch a lighter tone. The bits that are, pardon me, deeper will of course be the dark bits, and the bits that are somewhere in the middle will be in the middle, facing sort of different directions. So the parts that might face the light will be lighter, and so on. So, you know, the facets of this rock, depending on the direction, will look towards the light or look away from the light, and that's where we get the illusion. So this is why I'm very keen for people to analyze a picture before you start it, because then you know the way certain things are built. If you know how they're built, you know how you can fix them. You know, and as I say, sometimes it's a bit like, you know, mechanics. You know, they may, you know, a good mechanic can fix most any car. You know, some people say, oh no, he or she, they just don't do BMWs or something, you know. But a good mechanic has taken cars apart so much that they start to know the fundamentals of it all. Okay, so you can see breaking these various tones up. What I'm going to do now is get a slightly deeper tone, a slightly cooler color. So we're going adding some of the blue in here, but not to the extent we did with the very dark slashes at the start. So in here you can see this bluer, colder color going in the gaps. So occupying that space and so on. Remember, I know I'm working quite fast here, you know, for the purposes of this, but you know, in reality, if you're doing this yourselves, please take as long as you need to take. Let that one go right out there. And by simply producing a series of variously toned stripes, which is basically all we're doing, we are beginning to create something that's got ridges, and therefore something that might be believable as a very you know, slashed, cut old piece of rock on the beach, you know. Because all painting, all art, but painting is an illusion. You know, we when we paint as artists, we create illusions, and hopefully those who look at our work will believe it's whatever we have chosen it to be. So the way you create an illusion is to get to know what the original looks like. In other words, if you want to do an impression of someone, you have to look at them and what's their little quirks and what makes them the way they are. And then when you come to do the impression of them, you will have that. That's a wee bit red there. I don't know what happened there, but we'll put the slightly darker tone on just to cover that up. So we've got dark, medium, light. We've got warm, reddish brown. We've got cool grey. We've got something here in the middle, which is almost virgin on a sort of a purpley colour. But what we have from this is a structure, something that it's looking ridged. And I actually think what I'd like to do, and I am going to do, is get some even deeper shadows in here, and let's make this rock, you know, really look a wee bit more dramatic. So I'm adding quite a lot of blue to my sienna to the point where hopefully it's nice and neutral, nearly a black, not quite, but very, very close. And maybe down in some of these smaller bits, I'll just put a little bit of this dark. Okay, so here and there, and there, you'll see that there are little white slashes that I haven't covered, and I'm going to hopefully sort that out in a second. At the top of the rock, think about this: the sides of these ridges might also be like little humps. So I'm putting a little bit of dark across them to give them, rather than them looking like a cutout, cardboard cutout, that they look like they're three-dimensional, like they're bumps across the top of it. And I think in painting, especially when you're working on working on things like this, exercises, don't be afraid to put fairly dark tones in if it helps you see the illusion, because that's what it's about. This is not a painting that's ever going to hang in a gallery or anywhere else, maybe for that matter. So don't be concerned about that. So you can see what we're getting here. Now what I'm going to do, remember what we said earlier about edges. Obviously these are all fairly streaky with fairly crisp edges. What I might like to do is just ever so slightly soften them. I don't want to soften them too much, because I do want the rock to look as if it's got a harshness to it, a cut edge. But basically with a brush, you can see that I'm cleaning it just very gently, feathering along, especially the bits that I've left with a little bit of white, just flicking it. You might be able to hear the sound, but it is like flicking, and I think I've said it before, it should be like flicking dust of a valuable vase. You don't want to press it so hard that the vase will knock over. You can see that, or rather hear that. Wiping all the time, because we're lifting paint off, remember. Wipe that so that that's slightly softer. And you can do that until you're sort of happier with it. But you can see that's up to you. What I might actually do, again, since it was going dark, I might say, well, let's just, play with this illusion. This is what we're here to do, play and find out about things, just maybe put a little light tone in here. Just hold on, I'll get a little bit of white. I'm just trying to get it slightly off white, but not too much, In other words, you can see here on that little thing just about white. I'm just thinking, what if we just try to catch? And I'm following the shapes, by the way. Remember, I'm still following these shapes, these vertical strips, because that was the essence of what made me feel that rock looks the way it looks. And it could be, I'm thinking, well, this is maybe a wee bit even, so maybe what I need to do is just, cut some more bits out of it. What I mean is, if we go back to our dark, very, very dark color with the blues and browns, just get some more blue going on here, and just go in here, and break. Sorry, got a wee bit too much blue in that, I think. Just want it to be a wee bit grayer than that. I think that's a wee bit better. And just fleck a little bit of something else in there, here and there. So breaking these shapes, but still following the pattern. That strips. That's the essence of our S shapes. And we can begin to feel maybe we're making the rock look a little bit more rugged, more natural, more weathered is a word maybe I was looking for. And we can develop that on and so on. And we can see, actually, I think what I would like is maybe that to be a wee bit harder there, that edge just a wee bit harsher, not just as round, if you know what I mean. And maybe take this out. So you see what happens, especially with me, is I start to get fascinated with certain things, but all I've done is create variations of tone in a particular shape, and I'm beginning to get something that looks like a craggy rock. Okay, so I would like you to have a go at this idea, of course, but before I finish with this, because it's interesting, sort of, and as I say, fun to do this. Just maybe with my blue mainly. Let's get something around here, because it's this old thing. When we have a lot of light color in the background, it tends to destroy other things. I'm just taking that back a wee bit more again to get the sheen of the oil out of your eyes, as it were. And so what I'm doing is putting a gray blue here. That's blue, white, tiny bit of burnt sienna, very tiny, just to grey it. To give a sense, maybe a context here, let's pretend it is by the sea, this rock. You know? So there's, I think, discovery in painting, there are two elements. One is the formal, looking hard, analyze, you know, you can't escape. You shouldn't, I don't think, escape observation and looking and trying to take things apart. But then there's the other side, which is taking a little bit of risk and experimenting a little bit. And we learn that way too, you know. But I think we have to have both, you know. I think sometimes, especially when when we're watching certain demos and things on TV or wherever, we're overwhelmed by the impression that, you know, it's very impressive to watch someone doing something. That doesn't mean you understand how it's done, you know. I have sat and watched amazing footballers playing, and I've been totally overwhelmed at their skills, but I walk away not actually being able to do it because I don't know how they do it. It's only when I would go and find out that I can use it. So, you know, that's the thing. Anyway, what I've got here is this sort of suggestion of maybe horizon or something. And again, typically of me, being a bit obsessive, I just wonder what would happen if I maybe I'm going to try and create some splashes here just for a bit of fun, you know. I'm just digging around for another slightly different brush here. I've got a rounded brush there, look, see that, fairly big. I think it's probably a 12 or something like that. And I'm going to take my white, going to take some of that greyish blue that I had, and with the round brush I'm going to stab that and just see, I don't know, see what occurs. As I say, we're getting a little shine here. I don't want too much, but and I didn't plan to do this, but why not just over this, up just beyond the rocks. Let's see if we can pretend that we have waves crashing, you know. I don't know about you, but it's been so long since I think I've been out because of all of the various lockdowns that I haven't, don't know if the last time I saw the sea, certainly. Spent much time over there, you know, but just I'm taking the front end of that brush there and I'm stabbing it, but as I'm doing, I'm watching, because I want variations, you know. Waves are not all the same color and tone, but you know, so in other words, what I mean by that is probably what happens as the wave would disappear slightly behind the rock. You might get a deeper grey here, you see, like this. So, you know, it's the lights on the top of it. So what we're getting is this deeper grey. I'm just using the dregs of my paint up here just to do that. So there's the grayer, and then radiating towards the light at the top. Keep on the move. I don't want it to be too even. So there's the grey coming up, but like a great big cloud, really, you know. And some of the splashes will probably be going over these, but I haven't done that yet. And see if I can do this with fairly heavy paint at the top, whether I can get a bit more sense of the spray and the light. And on the edge of it there, look. Now I'm starting to make the noises which I promised myself I wouldn't do. You know, so something like that, you know. And what we'll do is we'll just wipe the brush and just gently, I'm going to gently destroy that edge there, because like the wave splashing over. Important to keep moving the brush, turning it and so on, otherwise you get a very regular pattern because you're making the same imprint each time, you know. So kind of getting something going on there with regards. Remember, we're working wet into wet. It would be much better, I think, if I was working over the dry rocks, but that's just the way it is. And then what I'll do, I'll just use the same brush, because what we need to do then is create that there's something going on here in the horizon. So we need to give the wave a shape, because you can't see it against that yellowy sienna background that I put on. So I'm just making making a dark area around it. Pretend that's the horizon now up here, so that the wave is more visible. And we can work that away up there and so on. Bring that back a wee bit so maybe we can see that. So kind of we're having a bit of fun, and we're getting something happening here. And you know, dynamic sort of picture, you know, and fun. But going back to the fundamentals, we watch the shapes, we look at the tones, we look at the edges, whether they're hard or soft, and we look for any other marks. I mean, the wave, different shapes. The tones were different. The edges are soft compared to the harder edges of the rock. So you paint anything if you follow these patterns, ultimately. You know, and there are other elements, of course, we have to consider, but this is a great way to make a start, you know. I've now, of course, become fascinated with the waves. I'm getting carried away. But so before I, again, literally get carried away with all of this, I will finish and encourage you to have a go at this and enjoy it. All right, so what I've done is I've wiped away the previous exercise, and actually what's kind of nice is the greys that I've used have allowed me to stain this bit of board towards the grey rather than brown, so that's kind of nice, you know. And by the way, don't be afraid, that idea of doing things and wiping them out as an exercise, you know, never get too precious about your images, especially when you know what you're doing is meant to be an exercise. So it's psychologically very good, I think, because we do worry a lot about, oh, you know, it took me 2 hours to do and I can't let go of it now, you know. But when you overcome that, it's a very good thing. It's a very confidence building. Okay, so now what we're going to think about is the second group of rocks that we looked at, the rounded boulders, and work through the words that we broke down there. So when we looked at shape, we described them as being curved and rounded, which is obvious, of course. We looked at tone. In this case, we said the tones weren't as extreme. They were a wee bit more subtle from light to shade. They weren't so, you know, dark light extremities. The edges, well, of course, the edges were softly blended. They didn't have the hard line between one tone and the other that the previous type of rock did, of course. And the marks, again, we had little scratches and dots and scrapes within the stonework. So we'll try and get that in as well. So we work through that STEM thing again and just break it down. I know it sounds very simplistic, but we don't do it. And the reason we sometimes struggle with painting is we don't break things down before we start. However, I'm going to start with my pencil again as I did previously so that hopefully you can see what it's about. So shapes, okay, let's create those sort of shapes. Rounded, curved shapes, okay, egg-like shapes. I'm going to put one in behind here as if there's a boulder back in there. Maybe another little one up in behind those two, and so it goes, and maybe a nice biggish one back in there, for instance. So let's say we have those little that set of little four. So we've created our shapes based on our analysis. Now we're going to look at tone. Well, we said there was light and shade, but not too extreme. So what I'm going to do is make up, again with the black and white, you can see here, greys that aren't as extreme as this, perhaps so much as they were in the previous one. So I'm mixing up, you can see here, a mid-grey, something that's not too extreme. Just set my palette down here. So let's say we decide again that the light's going to come from our right hand side. So we'll rub in this lightish tone over here. And we'll keep in mind that curve that we talked about. So the light and shade shapes, if you like, were also curved. So you have an arc of light here. What I'm going to do now is make a slightly darker tone here and make a second arc like this. or an ellipse I should say. So all of our shapes are curved because that's what we said at the beginning. For the moment, I'm not going to blend those right now because what I'd like to do is first of all create a few more. So in here, we'll have perhaps an arc going up that way. And that'll be a deeper shape there. Then we'll make a slightly lighter arc somewhere there. Now we're going to have to refine this in a minute so that one looks like it's behind the other. But we'll do that. So there's another curvy shape. All of the shapes, the theme of this picture is curvy, almost banana-like shapes. You see that? So we have 3 strips. And maybe while I'm at it, I'm going to put a little ellipse up there. So all of our shapes are based on these swirly sort of shapes. So I've got light on my brush at the minute, so I'll make that a lighty shape. But again, look, I'm curving the edge. Going to come down to the mid gray here, curve it around like that, and then maybe down to the bottom. We'll make this a little bit deeper. So there's another deep tone there. And again, I am not looking at the photograph as I do this. This is from my mind, because what I want to do is carry the information that I remember from the photograph by breaking it down the way we did, and then apply it to my own picture to see how well it works. And that then kind of is a challenge. So there's another curvy light bit. So you can see light down to dark in these elliptical curvy shapes. So the edges aren't straight, they're curved. Now what I'm going to do is just take that little soft nylon flat brush that I used previously. It's pretty clean. And now ever so lightly pull the light tone slightly towards the darker tone. So just, I describe this nearly as if I was trying to flick dust off a very valuable vase or something. You know, I do not want to make so much pressure that I'll knock the thing over. So imagine you're doing that. The brush is barely touching the board, but you can see it is softening away. I'm working crisscross, you see that way, back that way. And every now and again give the brush a wipe. Go into this one, same thing, diagonally that way. Wipe the brush diagonally that way. Don't go too far in, otherwise you destroy the dark because you just push that over into that. We're just working along the edge area. Wipe across diagonally, and now that's rounding up. And so we progress through the others. We're working the same principle, and we can create this nice egg shape boulders here. Okay, so we're getting a nice rounded thing. Now at this stage you can start to say, okay, well I want one to be behind the other a bit more. And obviously then you can begin to think, okay, there'd be shadow in here because if that's light, that's jumping out. So I'm making a darker gray, still using my little soft nylon brush here, putting a little bit in just where it meets that, and then very gently blending it with the rest. And so we can work around this for a little while. So let's say we can begin to deepen certain areas with a little bit of dark, so that looks like it's tucked in behind that one. And likewise, this one certainly is tucked in. So where it's tucked in gets darker. Then clean the brush and blend that out ever so lightly. And the same perhaps with this big one here. We'll put a reasonable dark tone in there, look, around there. And then wipe and then let it soften out slightly into some of the other tones around the edge. And you can do this to the point where you're happy yourself. So I mean, this is an artificially constructed thing, but look, it does now have the feeling of smoother boulders, because we followed the 4 words differently to the 4 words in the previous one. The previous one was angular shapes. This is rounded shapes. Previous one had very high, strong contrast. This doesn't have that. The previous one had sudden changes from dark to light, so the lines were straight. Here, it's blended and blended, so it's a soft transition. And now we move on to the last word, which was then marks again. And again, we can, if we want, go in with our little brush, as I did before. There's no medium in this, just straight into the paint. It's very, very dark grey. But again, I can maybe really see what we can do with these stones. So I can start working dark into dark. So where there's the dark area, I'm using dark, working that up. Maybe here and there, and we're going to tidy this up, as you know now. Depends on whether you see these as being all granity. And let's say we take this rock and say, well, look, we do want it to be quite grainy. Well, then keep your transitions. What I mean is, light, medium, dark, and so on, but change the brush mark on it. So now we're working in the dark area, but we're making a different brush mark with a smaller brush, but it is dark because we want to get that gradation. So then I'll move up to my medium tone, and now we can work across that in a medium grey, tap, tap, tap. And again, we're going to tidy this up. It looks almost splodgy here. And then we'll work up to a lighter tone at the top. Just a wee bit more paint on there. And just work that in, across, and maybe a wee bit of highlight, but tap, tap, tap there. So again, it looks a bit like spotty dog. But what I'm going to do then is go in again with the old filbert brush, or the soft brush here, this little filbert, and this is where we tap again, and just watch the marks calming down slightly until we're happy with how calm we want them. Then we can all go back in. We might have that we want a bit more here and there, the odd larger bit of stone that's been chipped out or something like that, look. And again, we can work. So once we have the structures, we can begin, if you like, to enjoy breaking them and creating texture. And then again, filbert, just ever so gently tap that to settle it in. And we begin, you can see how that's beginning to glow and have a shine or solidity about it, but also it's beginning to have some sort of surfaces on it. So we can keep progressing with that. Likewise, what I did remember with the previous picture, what I'm going to do is just give it a wee bit of background. So because again, it's sitting on that very plain sort of grey. So let's get some tone in, as if again it's maybe sitting on the beach or something there, because it will determine the tones overall. So we'll put that up there as if that's the horizon line, and we'll get round these. So it's just a mid grey to start off with, and then I can begin to say, okay, I know maybe in here would be shadows. Let's bring them down to the ground. These rocks, so they're heavy things, so they're going to cast fairly heavy shadows in there underneath. Let that go across there and so on, and then get more paint just around here, beg your pardon, I'm knocking the camera there, so you can see what's going on there, and maybe drag these down at quite nice wet into wet look, and there, maybe suggesting that it's a wet beach or something, a bit wet sand. And then maybe just one last thing we'll do is maybe put a little bit of light tone here that suggests maybe if there's a horizon and this is the sky or whatever. Now that light is meeting light. Do you notice that? Light meeting light here. So we're going to have to choose that we either bring down, and I think I'll bring down the tone here a little bit more, rather than, so that the light of the rock will jump forward. Okay, so we'll maybe do that. But I think we can begin to see some sense of these particular type of rocks sitting on somewhere, and that is because we used those words and we asked ourselves, what do we see? We didn't ask about all the videos we've ever seen of people painting rocks. We've broken it down from an artist's point of view. What I'd like to do now is actually make some changes to this little image. I thought it might be quite interesting to go back to this and change the look of it using the principles that we've talked about. In other words, the shapes, the tones, the edges, and so on. So what we have here obviously is very, very rounded shapes. You can see this is the one here I was working on, pardon me, to get a more of a textured surface. But what would be quite nice to do is develop, say, this one, which is very much like an egg shape. And let's say go back to changing the shapes that we see. So in other words, at the moment, we have one great big egg shape. Within that, there are 2 or 3 of these elliptical shapes I mentioned earlier, which have been kind of blended together very, very softly. But as an experiment, if I was to take, and I'm just taking small amounts of different shades of greys here that we're using. I'm using a little brush. You can see here, it's a small filbert brush, a little nylon filbert brush. You can see the rounded top on it. And again, it's just a little nylon brush, maybe a number 2 or 4. You can see against my finger, it's really quite small. And if I was to create some new shapes on this base here, so let's say I split this area up into various pieces. I'm not going to change the outline as such. I'm just going to decide, okay, what I'm going to do this time is create different shapes. So there's a sort of a rectangular shape or whatever. My days at school with geometry or whatever it was, I'm not so good at remembering all of these different geometric terms other than triangle and square. Speaking of which, there's a triangle. So I'm going to put in a few more of these here. And this is purely an experiment. I hadn't originally planned to do this, but it might be an interesting sort of thing to do. So I'm just taking my time here. This is paint virtually from the tube. Really, there's no medium mixed in it. Really. I'll see it up there. I'll take the lighter tone and make a biggish shape like that, and maybe down here have a zigzag sort of shapes. And it starts to resemble almost a sort of any decorated Easter egg here, you know. Let's go down to the bottom. Maybe have a long, dark shape there. So we'll go to the edge and we'll go across this sort of triangular shape that way. And keep down on the darker theme. Let's say create a long, irregular but hard edge. In other words, you can see the edges are quite sharp on these. I'll do another big dark one, say over here, zigzag out in and back out again. So they're like jigsaws, really. Jigsaw shapes. I keep finding tongue twisters today for some reason. Another kind of semi-triangular shape. So maybe a dark one up here, a little piece of dark, make that sort of more rectangular. It's absolutely no, these are fairly random as I'm going. I'm thinking what I'm making up. It's what we do and how we do the next bit will be interesting. There's a very light bit there. Maybe a little tiny light rectangle about there. And we have a few more spaces left that were not occupied. So we'll just take a medium grey, similar to the grey that I already had. A little tiny bit lighter than that. And just occupy those a little bit. So a straight line there, there. So hopefully you can get the idea of what I'm doing. Just creating these angular jigsaw shapes. Fill in that little space there and there. So what we have is this very odd, well not odd, but a different thing going on compared to the others. Now what I'm going to do is wipe the brush completely as best I can, because all of the oil is here. I don't really need. And remembering what we did earlier now, we're just beginning to wipe and merge slightly. I'm not going to merge them too much, just a little bit. So I'm not going to merge them all into one because that defeats the purpose. I'm just softening away the edges of each of these shapes by tapping around the edges. Wipe, tap a little bit, wipe, so on. Along here, tap, tap, wipe. Down the edge of that, wipe it. Because remember that every time we do that, we're taking paint off the canvas of the board. Where's that? Get this big light one, merge the edge of that there, merge that, and this, and merge the side of that one. And then go along that one. And what I hope you're starting to see is all of these are kind of joining, but not joining. The edges are getting softer, so they're not as defined, but we can see fairly clearly the hint of different shapes going on in there. Maybe split that one up a wee bit, and the ones near the top here, blend that a little bit, and that, and so on. And that V shape there along the edges of that. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to begin to try and make the edges slightly irregular. So now what I'm going to do is with the lighter color, rather than the curve, I'm going to change the shape of the edge so it's coming up and down, maybe up a bit. So I'm making the edges a little bit like the inner parts of it, so that you see that it's no longer get the darker tones down the bottom. We make that stick out and come in out. It's kind of merging with the background a bit, so I might have to change that, but we'll worry about that in a second. Bring that in, stick that out. So in other words, I'm slowly now beginning to take away the rounded edges and make edges which are zigzag, like that, you know. And the same, let's go back to the top of the light side. I'm making this particularly light, but maybe that's okay. And then let that go, let that stick out there like a big jagged bit there, look. And maybe the medium one. And so hopefully maybe make that darker so we see it for the moment anyway. And out and in. So you can see that zigzaggy thing around the edge. I'm now cleaning the brush again, and this time I'm going to merge those a wee bit. So obviously you can see the line where I painted them. So I'm just going to tap that in so that it softens in with those other shapes that I put on earlier. And I'm just breaking it up gently, tapping, wiping, you know, keep on tapping there, tapping here, and so on. And so that it doesn't look too much like a line as much as it did earlier there. And the same with that. And what I hope you're starting to see is a structure beginning to happen that looks like a rugged, chunky rock or stone or piece of solid thing. Compare that to the smoothness of that. What I'll just do, just to separate it, is I'm going to put a bit of dark behind that on that other rock that's just behind it, so that this one will come forward even more. So I'm just going to block that in very quickly so that the lighter edge of that leaps forward. You can see that, hopefully, that edge a bit more clearly now. And likewise, I'm just going to take and scrape out some more dark paint. Still working just with black and white. And then let's see if we were to put in a little bit more slightly lighter tone down here in the background. So what was dark will make light, because I just want to let us see how I have created a shape that now looks like a rock that's not a smooth boulder. It's not like the first ones we did quite. It's not as jagged as those, but it's more crinkly. So I'm just just brush that all out. All I want to do is that dark edge so it jumps, so you can see it a bit better. So you can see the structure of this rock, or a rock type form, that has changed from being like these to being a different structure. Because what did I do? I changed the shapes from no shapes, or rather shapes that are gentle and curvy. I occupied it with lots of triangles, rectangles, irregular but geometric shapes, and then broke the edge up so it became jagged and unlike these, then very gently softened together. So that's why it's not as rugged as the previous section of this video, because where we didn't have any. We had a straight, flat, clean line. I have just gently softened the lines between all of these little geometric shapes, and the result is something that starts to look like a rugged rock, another tongue twister, but not a sharp rock, not quite so sharp. If I wanted to change it again, I then decide, well, the edges, the E becomes very sharp again. So let's say I say, okay, no, I'll put this shape in, and this time leave the shape, the edge rather, crisp. So I'm not going to blend the edges together this time. And now we'll put a nice light bit up there and a nice crisp edge. You see that? And I can do that 2 or 3 times the other parts and go down there. So I'm suddenly tidying up the edges again after blending. I'm now just deciding, well, look what happens if my edges become crisper again. And you will notice that the rock then becomes different. The rock then becomes more jagged. It's a different quality of material because I've changed the edges. So there's this crisp edge. You can see that coming in there and there. And look, that starts to look much more harsh than the bottom bit. In other words, that starts to look more craggy because I'm making these straight, unblended edges. You see that? So you can see how that looks as if it's, if you touched it, it would feel different to what you would feel down here in the rock. And then if I destroy the edges, in other words, the E of edges, the edges become softened. And soften that edge and soften this edge. White, soften very, very, very lightly. And the same with these dark bits again, take them back. And they go back into becoming what they were a few moments ago. This slightly less harsh thing, but nevertheless still like a rock. So hopefully you found that little demonstration useful. And the whole purpose of this, particularly this first lesson in this series, is just to get into our minds this idea that when we look at things, we break them apart and then we can reconstruct them as a painter, if you like. We don't get overwhelmed by the fact it's a rock or it's a tree, and people will think I'm not a good painter if I don't make it look like a tree and whatever. Eventually, you can paint in any style you want. Anybody can paint in an impressionist style or an expressionist style or abstract if they want. But if you look at the world around you, first of all, and dissect it, then the paintings you do are going to be much, much better no matter what style you work in, because you know how the engine works, as it were. And that's a very important point that I have always tried to get across. I believe it's a very dangerous thing to look at someone else painting and in a flashy sort of a way, and then just copying that, because that doesn't mean you understand what's going on yourself. And that is the difference between really getting the grips with painting and enjoying it so much more actually when you do that, than simply just making copies of the same marks. Yes, they might look pretty, but it will be the same tree every time. It will be the same rock every time if you just do it that way. So hopefully you'll carry forward from this lesson into the next 4 and apply this sort of idea and develop even a better language of art. So now what you want to do is your own thing. Now it's over to you. You want to produce a little exercise just as I have there, and then take a photograph of or photographs of what you've done, and email it to me, and then I will come back to you with a bit of feedback and illustrate any suggestions that I have to help you along with that. So good luck and get painting now.